We are in week 5 of our series called Every Story Matters. And this is the series that we have chosen to kick off our new church. If you haven't been with us or don't know, we were a part of a bigger church called Summit Church for almost 2 years. They helped launch us and plant us. And about 5 or 6 weeks ago, we were sent off by them to become our own congregation here in Cheney, which is super exciting. And so we chose to start to name our very first series of Renew, Every Story Matters. And the reason for that is that my hope and Melissa's hope, and those of us that are kind of with us in this, our hope is that this idea that every story matters will be embedded into the DNA of this church. That our hope, obviously we want people to know Jesus, we want people to know that they're loved, but sort of like right underneath that, what we are hoping is that the people of this church will know and understand that every single person has a life story and that their life story matters. That the things that they have been through, the things that they have experienced have shaped them. The things that we go through affect the way that we think about life, that we think about God. And as I've said many times, I feel like over the last several years, the church has not done a great job of listening to people, of just sitting and listening. We've done a really good job of yelling at people and telling them things. But our hope here is that we will listen. We'll listen to the stories around us, especially as people are trying to figure out who Jesus is. So that's kind of the heart behind Every Story Matters. And we took the first 3 weeks to talk about kind of some big picture stuff. And then just, 2 weeks ago, because we weren't here last week, but 2 weeks ago, we started to dive into the Bible a little bit more and look at some specific stories of life change. Stories that matter to Jesus, where Jesus enters into people's lives and transform them. So, and actually, this week, we were in John 9 2 weeks ago. We're going to jump back a chapter, and we're going to be in John chapter 8, which we'll get to in a minute. There's lots of different ways to read the Bible. You can read, what I mean by that is you can read the Bible with the intention of like getting some history. You can read the Bible with the intention of like meditation, maybe spending like a lot of time on just 1 or 2 verses. Something that's been helpful to me over the years, especially as I read the narratives of Jesus, is I try to look for myself in the stories. I don't know if you ever do that before, but sometimes I'll ask myself like, who am I in this story? And sometimes I'll find myself really closely identifying with somebody that I'm reading about. I'll say, man, that is totally me. Like that guy or that gal, that's exactly what I'm going through. Other times, my initial response sometimes is to say, like, I'm nothing like that person. That's not who I am at all, only to find out upon closer inspection that I'm more like that person than I would like to admit. And so my hope today, as we get ready to read this narrative in a couple minutes, is that you will look, that you will ask God and you'll look at the text and try to figure out, God, is there somebody in this story that represents where I'm at in my life? As we get ready to engage on John chapter 8, you might notice, if you have a physical Bible in front of you, if not, we're going to put some stuff on the screen here in a minute, but this is sort of interesting. If you have a physical Bible, you're going to see something right above this passage that says something like this. The earliest manuscripts do not include this section. Does anybody have a physical Bible that says something like that, or there's a note? Yeah, a couple of you. So the earliest manuscripts do not include this section. I want to talk to you a little bit about that. For some of you, this is going to be totally like nerdy and you don't care, but for others of you, you're kind of interested in that stuff. And I actually think there's a reason why I'm going to spend a couple minutes on this. I think it's important to us, but that's sort of fascinating that our Bibles would make a note that says the earliest manuscripts don't have this, so what does it mean? Well, here's the deal. The New Testament, this is Jesus and everything after, this is this portion of our Bibles here, was written by many different authors. Some people don't realize that. It wasn't written by one person writing a big, long narrative. It was written by many different people, mostly in letter form. So Paul, who we talked about lots here, he wrote half of the New Testament. We studied one of his letters in our last series to the Colossians. So he wrote some. This guy named James, Jesus' brother, who was also a pastor, he wrote a little letter. There's an author to Hebrews. And then you have these Gospels. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they tell the stories of Jesus. Well, when these people went to write down these stories, there was an original copy. They wrote something down at some point. There was an actual letter, an actual manuscript that was written, and we do not have these originals anymore. They don't exist. If they existed, they would sell for $600 million on eBay. They would be very, very desirable, but we don't have them. And this might surprise some of you, but in the first century Jerusalem, they did not have photocopiers. You could not take a photocopy of a manuscript. You could not text a PDF to yourself or scan something, right? So the only way to produce a copy of a document in ancient Israel was what? To hand copy it. That was the only way to make a copy of something. And so within the first 100 years of the church, we have people that are professionals. They are professional scribes. Their job is to hand copy these letters over and over and over again. And so over the first couple hundred years of the church, we have thousands of these manuscripts that exist. Now, you might imagine, and you would be right, that there might be some human error involved. In other words, even the greatest scribes and the people that are very, very good at their job, from time to time, they might make a mistake. From time to time, they might miss a letter. From time to time, in fact, sometimes what would happen is as somebody was copying a script, they might make a little note in the margin, like maybe some of you do when you're studying your books, right? You make a little note in the margin, and then the next person to copy it might include that in the text, thinking it was a part of the original. So we have some of these, what we call like textual variations. And on very rare occasions, you might have a scribe who felt the need to actually insert something themselves into the text that wasn't there initially. Think about it this way. Imagine that you have a diary. Does anybody don't raise your hand. Do people have diaries anymore? No, probably not. You just do like a vlog on your phone. No, not even that. No, nobody cares about their lives anymore. But imagine that you had a diary and you kept all your stuff in there, your deepest thoughts, and your little sister got a hold of it. And she wants to know everything that's going on in sister's life, so she takes it, and she's not old enough to have a phone yet, so she decides to hand copy your diary. So she does like a pretty good job in there. She might draw like a couple heart emojis in there at some point, but she copies it. And then your mother gets a hold of your diary, or actually the copy of the copy. So she gets a hold of the sister's diary, and she goes to copy the diary. Now, as she's reading all about your stories, she comes across maybe a recent entry where you went on vacation together. You had a family trip, and you were writing all about your family vacation, and you decided to skip the part where you were driving and your dad had to slam on the brakes because there was a deer and you spilled a milkshake all over you. You didn't put that in your diary, but your mom felt like that would be really important. So when she writes the copy of your story, she inserts this little story about the milkshake, right? Now, if we were to read mom's diary, mom's copy of the diary, we might take it as the original. We might say, yeah, that's what happened. Until what? Until we find your copy, and then we realize there's a little bit of a discrepancy. Does that make sense? And so this is essentially what has happened here. Most scholars, and for some of you, this is like mind-blowing. You're like, this is like, you can't talk about the Bible like this. Yeah, we can. It's okay, I promise. Almost every scholar is in 100% agreement that the story that we are going to read was not originally written by John in his gospel, okay? That's just like a fact. We have the ability to look at we have lots of manuscripts, thousands of them, and sometime we'll talk about like the reliability of the Bible, how we got it and all that stuff. It's fascinating, it's very reliable, but we're not gonna do that today. But based on the language, based on the flow of the text, it's just very clear that this was not something that John wrote originally in his gospel. In fact, that's why it says the earliest manuscripts. So we have early copies and late copies, and none of the very earliest manuscripts have this story in John. So that brings up a question, right? Well, what do we do with this? Does that mean it's not the Bible? Some pastors say, yeah, like I'm not going to teach this section because it wasn't probably written by John, therefore it's not the Bible. Well, I guess that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, which many scholars do, and this is the camp that I would fall into, would be to say this. Well, let's look at the story and let's figure out, does it seem authentic? In other words, does this seem like a true story about Jesus? And it's my contention, along with many people, that this 100% seems like a reliable story that probably really happened involving Jesus, and somebody realized, hey, nobody put this in the original, this is probably worth putting in. Now, it's entirely possible we might find an oldest manuscript that has it. So the jury is still out. But for me personally, when I look at this, it's kind of like if you've ever had somebody tell a story and they said something like this, like, oh my gosh, I was talking to your dad the other day and he said this. And you think to yourself, yeah, that sounds like something my dad would say, right? You ever said that about somebody? Yeah, that sounds like that person. This sounds like Jesus is what I would say. There's nothing in this that we're going to read, in my opinion, that contradicts anything else in the scriptures. And in fact, I think it illuminates probably a little bit more about who Jesus was. So that's kind of the scoop on that. The bottom line is it was not in the originals, but I think it's going to be very profitable. So do with that what you will. Lesson over. Okay, we're going to start in John chapter 8, verse 1. Technically speaking, it starts in chapter 7, verse 53. It's very strange, but I'm just going to start. I'll read 7:53 and then go into 1. Here's what it says. They each went to his own house, verse 1, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and he wrote with his finger on the ground. So Jesus, as the other Gospels attest to, would often teach in the temple, and then he would go hang out at this place called the Mount of Olives at night, which was like outside the city walls of Jerusalem. And then it says here in the morning that he got up to come teach again. Now the temple, we've talked about this a little bit. The temple it wasn't just like a church building. It was really a central place of worship. It was big. It had courtyards. It would be almost like downtown for us. We'd say, I'm going to go hang out downtown. Like there was lots of action that happened. That's like the central place of culture. And so they had these big columns, and it was not uncommon for a rabbi, for a teacher to just gain a following of people. That a rabbi would sit and teach in the temple courtyard, and people would listen. Sometimes I think like that would be cool if this happened today, right? Like if you're just walking around downtown or on your college campus, and there's just like a wise sage teacher just teaching, and people just sit at the feet and listen. This is what Jesus did, and Jesus had a large crowd around him. The author says that all the people came to him. You guys know that phrase? Like young people use that now. They're like, all the things. You guys know what I'm talking about? I came straight from the Bible. All the people came. No, not all the people came, but in other words, there was a lot of people. There was a lot of people here. Jesus was becoming very popular. Jesus was teaching things that the other rabbis were not teaching. Jesus was saying things that they weren't saying, and so he was a popular teacher. People were listening to him. So all the people came to him, and it says that he sat down, and they were taught by him. And so you have to picture this scene of Jesus. Some people say he was like maybe sitting on a stool or on the ground, but he's sitting and he's teaching. And then this commotion happens. All of a sudden, you have to picture I just imagine the Pharisees and the scribes. These are the religious leaders, right? These are the religious elite. I don't know why I did this like a box. Maybe there's something symbolic about that. But they are the religious authorities. And I have to imagine, are just causing a stir and bringing this woman through the crowd, right? It's kind of like if you've ever been in a crowd and you're looking around like, what is going on? I hear something. And they bring in this woman and they plop her down at Jesus. At his feet, in front of everyone, right? It would be like if somebody just barged in here right now and just drug a woman up the stairs and laid her at my feet. No, that would make me like Jesus, which I'm not. That was a very bad analogy, but it's a crazy scene. Like this is wild. The Pharisees are causing a scene. They bring in this lady, and it says that they bring her in because evidently she was caught in the act of adultery. Now, right off the bat, there is something that is a little bit amiss here. And I'm sure some of you have recognized it. Immediately we recognize that there's something not right about this situation, and we're missing some details. The most obvious thing we're missing is not a thing at all. It's actually a dude, right? Adultery involves two people, and the man is nowhere to be found. He's not here. He's not mentioned at all. He's not drugged through the crowd and laid at Jesus' feet. It's just this woman. She is the one who's on trial. And I was reading it this week. I kind of had this thought that crossed my mind that not much has changed in the last 2,000 years, has it? In our culture today, women are often blamed for sexual indiscretions while their male counterparts are often scot-free. We use language like boys will be boys, and women when they're involved, they get called all kinds of names that are not appropriate for church. It's really only been the last 3 or 4 years, I think, that we've seen a significant change in our culture in terms of holding men accountable. Now, it could be possible here that maybe this man, maybe he took off and he ran and they found him later. So I don't know, the text doesn't say. But there is no doubt that there's a bigger part to this story right now because it's just the woman. There's no doubt. Both of them were caught, but it's just the woman. Notice that the Pharisees and scribes, they don't come to Jesus secretly. They don't come to him in secret and say, hey, this has happened. How do you want to deal with this? They have a bigger goal here. They have other reasons why they are doing this. They want the show, they want the spectacle, and what they really want is to trap Jesus. In fact, the text said that, right? In verse 5 it said, now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say? And it says they said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Okay? So they wanted to trap Jesus. A lot of, one of the reasons why people think that this is like an authentic Jesus encounter is because we see several other experiences in the Gospels where the Pharisees do the same thing. They try to trap Jesus. Like, Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar, right? They ask him all these questions, and Jesus always gives these most profound answers, and he always stumps them. But they want to trap him. Like, these guys had the real estate cornered on spirituality. And Jesus was coming in and he was bucking the trend. Jesus was a totally different kind of rabbi, and they didn't like it, and so they were trying to get him in trouble. And so they say to him, well, our law says that she should be stoned. The law is clear that somebody caught in the act of adultery should be stoned. Was this true? Yeah, this was true. This is what the law said. And so they say to Jesus, well, what should we do? Well, what's the trap here? Like, how are they trying to trap him? There's a little bit of some debate, but certainly on the one side, if Jesus says, like, no, she shouldn't be stoned, then very clearly they could call Jesus a false prophet. They could call him a false teacher. They could say the law says this, you do not follow the law, therefore you are guilty. So that's very clear on this side. On the other side, if he says like we should stone her, well, there was some political stuff going on with the Romans and the ability that the Jewish people even had to conduct stonings. There was some political stuff. Maybe they just thought we could catch him in contradictions. Jesus has been preaching love. Jesus has been preaching turn the other cheek. Jesus has been teaching, forgiveness. And so for Jesus to command the stoning of this woman might go against what he's been teaching. So either way, they try to trap him somehow, but Jesus doesn't fall for it. Imagine, it says here that he bent down in the dirt and he wrote something, and there's all kinds of speculation about what we wrote. We have no idea what he wrote, but he bends down and he writes something in the ground. And we just have to put ourselves in this moment for just a minute. I mean, imagine there are crowds of people. This is a spectacle. There are crowds of people. This woman, some scholars believe that she might have even been naked. That she was just caught in the act, that to humiliate her, they grabbed her, they threw her there. The text doesn't say that. Is it a possibility? Maybe. But there's no doubt that she is in a very precarious situation. It gets quiet. She's looking at Jesus. The crowd is looking at Jesus. They're looking at her. This is a unique situation. Let's pick up the story in verse 7. It says this, "And as they continued to ask him," the Pharisees, as they continued to ask him, he stood up and he said to them, "Let he who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and he wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. So it's quiet. You could almost hear a pin drop. Jesus kneels down in the dirt. He writes something. The Pharisees keep pressing him. What is it, Jesus? What are we going to do? Is it death? Are we going to stone her? What are we going to do? And Jesus, you just have to picture him, right? I just love I just love him. And he just stands up. And notice that he doesn't say, you shouldn't have justice. Notice he doesn't say, it's not wrong. What he says is, okay, whoever here doesn't have sin, whoever here is sinless, whoever here is perfect, whoever here has never violated one of God's laws, I give you permission to throw the first rock at her. Interesting, right? He affirms the law in this moment. Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He affirms the law, but he does something really miraculous, and it says that he bends down again and he writes in the dirt. I mean, you have to just imagine this is a wild scene. You can feel the gravity of the situation. What Jesus does in asking that question, or in saying, whoever here has never sinned, you go ahead and start, he forces them to look inside themselves. He forces them to take stock of their own lives before they cast judgment on someone else. He asks them to evaluate themselves. And what happens next is really remarkable. The text says that it starts with the oldest. And you can almost see this, right? You can see the Pharisees described. These are angry people. These are people with an agenda. And you can see them maybe even looking at each other like, is he going to pick up a stone? Are you, not me, right? Is someone going to pick up a stone? And then beginning with the oldest person there, perhaps the wise teacher, reflects upon his life and realizes I'm not in a position to do this. And maybe they even had stones in their hands ready, right? And you just hear the first stone drop. And it's just Jesus and the woman. It's interesting. It says that everyone leaves. It's just Jesus and the woman. I don't know if that meant that just the Pharisees and the accusers, left, or if the whole crowd left. But there's this really intimate moment that Jesus is going to have with this woman. Do you want to know something that I think is a little bit sad? Something that I think grieves me as I was reading this text is that, if I'm honest, I think that if Jesus were here right now and he were to say to us, whoever is without sin can pick up the first stone, I think that there are many Christians that would be very eager to pick up rocks. I think that there are a lot of Christians who forget that they have sin. I think there's a lot of Christians who think that they are without sin, or that they are, without sin, and they are throwing rocks everywhere. How do I know this? All you have to do is hop on Facebook or Instagram for more than 10 seconds, and you will see Christians throwing rocks at everyone, everywhere. We've become so delusional that we think that we are righteous when we are just as sinful and in need of God's grace as the very people that we are throwing rocks at. We throw rocks at women who have or are contemplating abortions, yet our lives are too busy to walk alongside them or maybe even adopt or care for the children that they're not sure that they want to have. We throw rocks at everyone whose sexual preferences or appetites or behaviors don't line up with what we think they should be, yet there is no discernible difference between Christians and non-Christians in terms of our pornography use. We cry out against exploitation of women and children, and yet we consume the very pornography that statistics are clear involve exploited women and children. We throw rocks about those who don't believe in the sanctity of marriage, and yet our divorce rates are not any better, and I could go on. And listen, none of this is to shame you or guilt you. The only reason I'm saying these things is because these are things that I have said and done and lived and experienced. We have to realize that we are not that different from the people that we are judging. We have the same issues. We do the same things. I think that Pharisaism, that's a word, is alive and well in the church. I think we need to take a good long look at ourselves, put down our rocks, and work on our own issues, and then maybe at that point we'll be able to help others. Jesus says this in Matthew 7:2. It's a famous verse. He says, "For in the same way that you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure that you use, it will be measured to you." This is one of the strongest statements, I think, in all of the scriptures that Jesus says. The God of the universe in the flesh says, listen, when you judge others with the force that you judge them, you will be judged yourself. I remember seeing years back, some of you have seen this before, there's a video on the internet. You can Google it, later on or right now if you want and laugh. I won't judge you, but because, that was funny. I won't judge you. Anyway. There's this, I think it was from this show, The Amazing Race, and they're doing like this watermelon catapult thing. Has anybody seen this before where they're pulling back these watermelons and they have to launch it and hit these fake people out in the fields. And this lady she pulls back this thing and it goes and it just whiplashes right back and explodes on her face. And I don't normally laugh at the injuries. She was fine. I encourage you to Google watermelon backfire and laugh and then confess later. But this is what Jesus is essentially saying here, right? Jesus is saying, listen, with the same force you come at people with, you have to be aware that that will be coming against you as well. I think these are serious words of Jesus. And so now we come to the climax, to the final couple of verses. In verse 10, after all the people have left, and it's just Jesus and this woman, it says this. It says that Jesus stood up and he said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." So Jesus looks up from the dirt. He comes up, and it's just him and this woman. And he says, "That's strange. Where did everyone go? Isn't there anyone left here to condemn you?" She says, "No, it doesn't look like it." And then Jesus says, "I don't condemn you either." Two observations. First, the woman is guilty. There is nothing in this text to indicate that she was falsely accused. There's nothing in this text to indicate that she was not caught in adultery. We don't see her petitioning. We don't see her saying, "You got the wrong person." I think the text is clear that she was caught in adultery. She's violated God's command. She's deserving of punishment. I don't think that is up for debate. Second observation, Jesus is the only one who actually has the authority to condemn her. Jesus was without sin. Jesus would have been justified to pick up stones and to start the process, and yet the only one with authority to actually condemn her is the one who says, "I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to condemn you." Jesus offers this woman grace. He offers her mercy in the lowest moment of her life, in the darkest hour. Jesus extends to her and says, "You might be deserving of penalty, but it's not going to be rendered to you today." If Jesus is able to extend grace and mercy to people who are guilty of sin, should we not be able to do the same? Are we better than our Lord? Are we a more righteous judge than Jesus is? Surely none of us would say that we are. Now, of course, Jesus doesn't end the passage with, "I condemn you." He does follow up with these words, "Go and sin no more." Some people take this to say that Jesus didn't forgive her, that he didn't offer her forgiveness, because there's other passages with similar situations where Jesus says specifically, your sins are forgiven. And so some pastors and scholars that I've read said Jesus wasn't, condoning it. He wasn't offering her forgiveness here. He's telling her, you better change your life. You better figure it out. In my opinion, I think that's poor interpretation. I think it's clear that when Jesus says, neither do I condemn you, that that's synonymous with him saying that you're forgiven, that I forgive you. But his grace and his mercy calls her upward. He physically lifts her from the ashes, and he figuratively calls her into a new and better life. When he says, go and sin no more, he's not, of course, suggesting that she's not ever going to sin or not ever going to make a mistake. That would be absurd. Rather, he is saying, I have a much better life for you. There's a life ahead of you where you don't have to live in the guilt and shame of adultery. I have a life ahead of you that won't leave you searching for fulfillment in illicit relationships or external things, but your fulfillment will be in me. I'm offering you new life. I'm offering you a new birth. I'm offering you a fresh start, because every story matters and your story matters, is what Jesus says to this woman. At the beginning of this message, I challenged you a little bit to look for yourselves in this story and to see who you resonate with. And I think that for most of us, I think we can see the Pharisees in us. I think if we're honest, we can say, yep, I'm 100% guilty of throwing rocks at people that I ought not to be throwing rocks to. I think we can all admit that, and we need to repent of that. At the same time, I hope that we can all find ourselves in the life of the woman here. We are all adulterers. We are all guilty in some way or another of violating what God desires for us. And we are in desperate need of Jesus to look at us and to say, you are not condemned, you are forgiven, you are loved, and you have the opportunity for new life. The Christian faith teaches that we are all in need of a Savior, that we are in need of grace, and that grace is available through Jesus. The Christian faith teaches that in some way, shape, or form that I still don't fully understand, that my guilt and shame was taken on the cross. That something happened on that cross cosmically to where any guilt and shame and condemnation I have is no longer because of Jesus, because of his death and his resurrection and his power over death. Romans 8:1 says this, it says, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Jesus Christ. This is the beauty of the message of Jesus, really. This is the good news of Jesus. This is the gift that Jesus offers us, and I believe ultimately it's our choice whether we choose to receive it or not, or whether we continue to go on in our own ways. I want to leave you all this evening with one final question, something to think about as you drive home and head into your week. And here's the question. Are you a thrower of rocks, or are you an extender of grace? Are you a rock thrower, or are you a grace extender? That's a serious question. Maybe a better question might even be, would others consider me to be a rock thrower or an extender of grace? Would people who look at my profiles online view me to be a rock thrower or an extender of grace? My hope would be that every single person that calls Renew Church of Cheney home would be known by the grace that we extend to people and not by the rocks that we throw. Would you stand with me? Here at Renew, we do often what's called a benediction, which is just me speaking some words of life over you to send you off into your week. So I leave you with this. May we be men and women who celebrate and give thanks to God that there is no condemnation for those who are in Jesus Christ our Lord. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We look forward to hopefully seeing you next week. Have a great week.